Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to our second installment of our new Fireside Chat. This month, we're thrilled to welcome Lizzy Diaz Ortiz. She is Vice President, Senior Advisor of Governance and Inclusion at BMO Harris Bank. She is an accomplished attorney with deep expertise in many areas, including helping drive diversity and inclusion programs and fostering cultural change, which of course will be a major focal point of today's discussion. As mentioned, we'd love for the session to be interactive. So if at any time you have a question, drop it into the chat or just speak up. With that, let's get started. Lizzy, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you decided to pursue a career in law, and in particular, what's your connection with IP law? I know you have a bit of a non-traditional path, like a few of us.
Yes, I had a winding path. Well, from when I was a child, I wanted to be a teacher and an attorney. So law school was pretty much inevitable. As for IP, I came to it from a creative background. So in a former life, I was a singer and I was interested in entertainment law specifically. And I thought I was going to be this hotshot entertainment attorney. And I worked at a recording studio in the city during law school. Not only did I audition for the musical Rent, but I did an externship in the legal department of the record label BMG US Latin in Miami, and I became involved with Lawyers for the Creative Arts. I worked there for a long time. I also did work at an IP firm where I was fortunate, they gave me all the trademark and copyright work because I was the only non-patent prosecution student. But that was my interest in law and IP specifically. But when I graduated at the time, and I'm dating myself, I was one of 3 people in the IP certificate program, and it was the first time, I went to Chicago, Kent, just for reference, one of the first certificate programs, and I was one of 3 who were non-patent prosecution. And the market was such that firms really had their pick of first-year associates, and without a technical background, I didn't have very many viable choices back then if I wanted to stay in IP. For example, one of my classmates was at the top of our class. She was editor of our journal of IP. She had no issues getting a job at a large law firm. And then my other classmate started his own firm. But I wasn't brave enough to do that with the limited entertainment law opportunities in Chicago at the time. And so I moved to New York, hoping to get a job there. I did a lot of contract work there, and then I eventually came back to Chicago. So I landed in banking and essentially what was LaSalle Bank then. And that's how my career in financial services started, in commercial mortgage-backed securities, reviewing agreements with a bunch of other attorneys as well.
Did you ever consider trying out for American Idol or
yeah, I had, so I'll just share. In New York, I was in this girl group, and I had considered it, but by the time I knew what it was, and after the first season, they had an age limit then. I don't know that they do now, but they had an age limit then, and I was already too old. so I didn't, and I didn't really care for the way that those shows, they're more popularity contests in my opinion than talent. And I was like, but they've made they found some really good talent. I'll say that.
Yeah. I'm not a singer, but I don't think I'd be brave enough to try out if I was.
It's a needle in a haystack. I mean, I don't know that I would get anywhere with that.
Okay, so how did you then progress to where you are today, leading diversity and inclusion program efforts at BMO Harris?
Yeah, so what's funny is that if you told me that I would end up in DE&I professionally, or which usually is within human resources, I wouldn't have believed you. I'm the most politically incorrect person, and the thought of being in HR was foreign to me. But I had always been involved in DE&I efforts and affinity groups through college and law school. I was the national president of the Hispanic National Bar Association when I was a law student. all these things I did in my spare time. And as I mentioned, I started working in LaSalle Bank in commercial mortgage-backed securities, and my career progressed, and I, did a stint as an expat in Mexico City. I came back. By then, Bank of America had purchased LaSalle, and kind of went through different jobs. I always had some regulatory or quasi-legal aspect to my roles because people knew my background and nobody wanted to touch regulations or compliance. And that led me to BMO. And after a few years, I transitioned to the role I'm in now, everything being regulatory focused, because again, I had that skill set. It just hadn't been applied in this context. So what I do is the regulatory affirmative action programs, equal employment opportunity, focusing on individuals with disabilities and veterans. And so using that regulatory compliance background and applying it in this role, it came about really quite organically. Nobody had been in the role for almost a year. I was looking to move, and just the skill set matched. It helped that I was passionate about DE&I, was involved in my organization. So I was able to speak intelligently about the efforts and what I could bring to the role. And that's how I ended up in the role on the team. And since then, the type of work that I do has expanded, because as you can imagine, over the past year, there's been a lot more demand, but also we're a rather small team. So if we don't have somebody who can lead training, it's like, Lizzy, can you do this? So I've been able to work outside of that regulatory realm as well.
How long have you been in the role? Remind me.
I've been in the role over 3 years now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you lead the effort for the entire company, though, is that right?
Yeah, so I'm on the team that does for the US focus, but I had, we just recently reorged, and I had the Canadian also responsibilities, because we're headquartered, BMO is headquartered in Toronto. But we've since restructured. They hired somebody because I said it's just too much to have both Canada and US and keep on top of the regulations when I didn't grow up there. I'm not as familiar. And there's a whole other set. And as you can imagine, in the US, the regulatory focus has increased over the last few years. There's focus on pay equity and reporting and all of that. So, but yeah, I'm on the team that leads the whole US focus.
All right. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about some statistics. So women have actually obtained parity with men in obtaining science and engineering degrees, and women of color in particular actually earn more of those degrees than their male counterparts. At the same time, however, law is America's least diverse profession, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. According to some ABA statistics that I found back from 2017, 85% of all lawyers in America are white, and of those, 65% are men. And I'm sure the numbers are still very similar today, unfortunately. And then if we look at the IP bubble, it's even more dire. According to the AIPLA economic survey from 2019, about 28% of IP attorneys or agents are women, just 28%. There aren't separate statistics on how many of those women are also ethnically diverse, but as a whole, only about 20% of IP attorneys and agents are ethnic minorities. What do you think are some of the contributing reasons that we don't see women or women of color entering IP law and then subsequently staying in it?
Yeah, those statistics are dismal and alarming. And I'll just add to that, that I'm going to get the name wrong, but the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession, IILP, I happen to know Sandra Yamate, who's the CEO of that organization. They did their 10-year study. They do the statistics every year as well. And she hands me this book in 2020, and this was before the pandemic. And I said, oh my gosh, that's a lot to read through. Can you just tell me what was most shocking to you? And she said, well, over 10 years, nothing has really changed. We haven't moved the needle. And in some cases, it's gotten worse. So to your point, the profession overall, and then, we have this segment that is STEM focused. So I think the reasons that contribute to that are antiquated practices and expectations. And bias. I'll speak to women of color in IP first. I read somewhere that, like you said, there are numbers for women of color in IP, but I think I read that Black attorneys in IP make up less than 2%. So if you're talking about women, it's probably, half of that maybe. And it's a double whammy for women of color in IP because there's a double bias there. There's race, ethnicity, and there's gender. And that intersectionality makes it much harder to overcome these perceived obstacles. And I say perceived because it's usually somebody else's perception and not the woman of color, the attorney of color. And usually the diversity efforts are focused on one group, either women or people of color, or if they're broadly focused, they aren't tailored. And when you have these social identities overlap, that creates different needs. So you can't have a one size fits all DE&I strategy. As you said, the pool is there, right? Women and women of color are earning more degrees or have reached parity. So we have the talent. That isn't the point, but I said antiquated practices and expectations because in law, for the most part, the general, and I'm not talking about specific organizations or law firms that have their own practices, but generally speaking, we still recruit from the same top schools that have the least number of diverse student groups. We still allocate work the same way that we know isn't always equitable. And doesn't always give everyone the opportunity that will then, generate them additional assignments, et cetera. We have the same expectations of billables and work hours, and we know that disproportionately impacts women, whether or not you have children, because women are more likely to be caretakers, whether they're children or aging or sick relatives. And we still have a competitive cutthroat culture that's focused on the old boys club, generally speaking. So who on this call wants to sign up for that, right? I mean, if that's the way it's pitched to you, and that's people who you're familiar, you're in the profession, people who are looking on the outside looking in or considering, there isn't a value proposition for them. And the problem is we aren't recruiting, focusing on IP either, because a lot of people think just patent and don't understand the whole scope of what IP law is, and recruiting, kind of marketing this career. But those practices, once you get in, are what keep women out, like they leave the workforce, or they're not making, partner, they're not staying, they're doing something else. So if we want to evolve, which we haven't necessarily as a profession, to attract and retain and develop women, and especially women of color, to stay, the value proposition has to be there. And, I named a few things: recruitment and work allocation, credit origination, billable hours, the same culture. But also progress is really slow. So you can be doing all the right things, but you're not going to see these numbers improve overnight. We're not moving widgets. We're not selling things. You're trying to dismantle these bias systems that have been in place for years, and you're investing in people. It's going to take a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And, despite the statistics that show that you should be investing and, looking at the long-term play, and that these diverse teams will lead to better results across the board, higher profits, all of that good stuff that everybody likes, there are still seemingly people who don't seem to understand the benefits of having a diverse team, or maybe don't buy into the business case, or so-called business case, I should say, for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives to begin with. So what advice would you give to someone who's trying to implement or elevate DE&I measures over reluctance or even resistance of others in their workplace?
Yeah, that's really tough, and that's usually the biggest obstacle. You have to have champions with decision-making power, and that usually means leaders at the top, because you're going to be faced with resistance. So you have to have somebody who can who has decision-making power. Also, it can't be this generic business case. It has to be a what's in it for me case. You have to address what your organization wants. And law firms are businesses, companies are businesses, they want to be profitable. So unfortunately, a lot of times if you say D&I, it's seen as this soft, intangible thing that would be nice to have. But it has to be a business initiative. You have to tie DE&I efforts to outcomes that are win-win and that are profitable, or that contribute to what your company or what your firm values, and get them to get there. So there's this great Harvard Business Review article on the art of persuasion, and it's long, but it's definitely worth it. And it talks about the psychology of it. We forget that this type of work can be emotional. It's highly psychologically focused. And you can have the best business case in the world, but if you cannot convince or persuade the person who holds the power, it doesn't matter. And it's not always the leaders, but the tone from the top down is essential. You can't always just focus on the DE&I component. You have to make it about the business initiative. If you're proposing, you broaden the schools that you recruit from, which happen to have more diverse representation because it's cheaper, it has a larger pool of students, it has whatever certificate program that your firm or your company is focused on recruiting those types of attorneys. You have to show how that's going to make money for your firm or how it's going to save money. And if that's one of the objectives or one of the goals that the company has or the firm. So sometimes calling it a diversity initiative has the opposite effect. You have to really think of it from a business initiative. And, we in law firms are businesses. There's billables, there's profits, profit sharing, and we tend not to always think of law as a business. And even if you're in-house, your client is the company and you're trying to save money or mitigate risk or what have you. You have to think about what's in it for me from a business perspective.
I want to go back to the Harvard Business Review article that you mentioned, and the art of persuasion. Is that founded on like the Aristotle 3 modes of persuasion?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I read it a while ago. It was a more recent, I want to say last year, but it gave, as HBR usually does, kind of cases of here was the situation and here's how the language around it, or how this person convinced their leader or their employee or what have you. It was really interesting because we tend to think about all of these other components, and particularly in DE&I, what I've noticed is a lot of it is organizational psychology and individual psychology.
Interesting. I'll have to track down that article, and then I'll maybe send it around.
Well, I'm sure I can find it, and I'll send it to you. You can distribute it.
It sounds like a good one that we should all put on our reading list. Okay, before I move on, any questions from anyone so far?
I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, but also try not to be distracted.
Yeah, I think I closed my chat, but okay. All right, so this past year's event, you've already alluded to it a little bit and how it's changed some of your responsibilities, but in addition, I think it's spurred a lot of self-reflection among a lot of us. Certainly, we've seen calls to action, revamping and revival of these DE&I initiatives and programs, among many other things. What do you think are some essential building blocks to someone who's creating or maybe revamping a successful program? You've already mentioned that it can't be one size fits all. So where else should we be thinking about
Sure. One of the basics, well, there are a few basics, but one of them is collecting and analyzing your data and making decisions based on what your organization's focus will be because of what that data tells you, to create a data informed strategy to set goals, not arbitrarily saying, well, we don't, like, sometimes you can look around and say, we have a problem, we don't have a lot of women. But beyond just the number, what's been the 5-year trend? At what point are they dropping off? When are they leaving? What type of work are they getting or not? That data collection and analytics will really help inform where you should focus. You have to understand what the objectives are going to be based on that, and then benchmark. You also have to identify who are going to be your change agents, your stakeholders, who's going to be able to make an impact. And they have to be part of the planning process. A lot of times, white straight men in particular, don't feel like diversity initiatives involve them, but they still predominantly hold the power of positions, influence. So they have to be involved in the planning. And a lot of times too, we put the burden of diversity on marginalized groups. And if you're not in a position to change things, then you're also not going to be in a position to propose changes that will be acceptable. And that leads to, you have to figure out how you're going to hold people and the organization accountable. But once you have, the data, you have the people, you understand what your goals are going to be because you've benchmarked, and all of those things, you really have to focus on your processes and your systems for the entire talent management cycle, which is vast. You're talking about outreach, you're talking about recruitment, hiring, onboarding, origination credit, performance evaluations. Like, you have to be willing to dig into all of those things to be able to make a difference. And so looking at them, one by one, and evaluating based on what your data is telling you, what should we be doing? What's the biggest opportunity we have for improvement here? It's a fact-finding mission, basically, and it has to be iterative as well. So it's not just going to be a one and done. So I would say, I've said a lot of things, but I would say, understanding the composition and where there are issues in your organization and addressing those specifically with people who can be your change agents or champions would be some of those building blocks.
For the data collection process, is that something that you typically see companies and firms outsourcing, like hiring someone to do that specific process, or are people hesitant to, open the curtains and they do it all in-house? Is there a way you would recommend, or maybe not recommend?
Yeah, so a lot of, so I'll just speak at BMO, and I know a few firms of people that are at firms, they collect it themselves. They may partner with an outside party in analyzing what they should be asking. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. As an applicant, they'll collect your information. If you choose to disclose, I identify as, female, cisgender, Latina, veteran, I'm not a veteran, etc. I have a disability, or as an employee as well, and have annual assessments of that and ask you to count yourself in. There's also employee engagement surveys where you can also receive feedback on certain things, but then dissect that information, if you include it in your engagement survey, by those different demographics. So you can slice and dice and say, oh, this group over here is really feeling that we don't have a culture of belonging, whereas this group doesn't have that. So that analytical part, you may engage externally, but it depends on the size of the organization. It depends on the appetite, budget, all of that. But usually the self-identification process and collecting that data, I have seen it mostly in-house with external tools and help.
That makes sense. Is there any, either in that data collection process or the analysis of it, do you think there's any common pitfall or mistake that you see companies or firms making as they, try to go through the process?
Sure. I think, again, the value proposition, like, why should I give you this personal information? So that's really important as an employee, because we're all employees, whether you're a partner at a firm or whether you're in-house and GC, you're still employed by somebody. Maybe it's yourself, but why should I divulge that? And building that and communicating that value proposition. Here's why. We value a culture of inclusion, and we need to understand who isn't getting visibility, talent development, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other component is probably not doing it often enough, and not asking the right questions. So I'll tell you that BMO, for example, we collect data on employees and candidates. We have regulatory obligations, both in Canada and the US, of things we have to ask. But we've also expanded because we know, for example, LGBTQ plus self-ID is not something that we're required to collect nor disclose to the federal government on either side. But we want people to know, if you identify as LGBTQ plus, you're welcome here, and let us know how many employees we have. Here's our ERG. There are things beyond just what you have to and basics to communicate. We value things. I would say, I've heard some collection of like political and religious association, and that is a little bit more or can be problematic and concerning, because you're focusing on ideology as opposed to the way that I identify. But that can be addressed through maybe other like affinity groups or something, as opposed to collecting data on what religion I, identify as having.
Great. So we got a question that I'll read out loud here for everyone's benefit. The question is that I've noticed some firms have a robust DE&I department with great intentions and programming, but there's a disconnect between that department and the attorneys with the power or business and decision-making power. How do you suggest bridging the gap between the DE&I department and the people or attorneys with the power that are within the firm or company?
Thanks for that question, Stephanie. Hi. That's a great question that honestly, I think happens quite a bit. And the DE&I department may not understand. So they may understand, the team or people may understand from a surface level, right? This is how compensation is. These conversations, roundtables, how performance evaluations are tied to compensation, et cetera. But they may not understand, yes, but the head of the compensation committee or, performance reviews is actually the person who's setting the agenda. There's meetings throughout the year, or how we calibrate. And honestly, just talking to the people in DE&I and explaining what that systemic process is and who could be those change agents, who are the decision makers. It may not be the head of the committee, right? It may be somebody else who has a stronger pull and influence. And it's important to understand those power players. Who are they? And having a frank conversation. I'm always for having an open conversation, and from an exploratory perspective too. So asking what drove this program? what's the objective, and understanding, because maybe there's, from your perspective too, a lack of understanding of the connection as well, right? So coming to it with good intentions and having an exploratory conversation, but being direct, I think, is always the best way to do that.
I have a question.
Yes.
Go
Hi,
for it.
Sarah.
I wonder first, and sometimes I get this question from clients in like an employment law context or human resources law context, and it's usually companies that aren't really big enough to have complicated data. You know, maybe they have 50 employees or 100 employees, maybe they hire 10 people a year or something. And often the owners are white males, but they're well-intentioned white males, and they come to me and they say, we really want to do better. We want to talk to our employees and be exploratory and find out, you know, what are we bad at? What are we doing wrong? How do we make a difference? But they also, you know, they're also sort of afraid to have frank discussions around the subject of diversity and inclusion. And, you know, and maybe they do feel that there are things going on in the company that they'd like to change, but they don't know how to approach it because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, stepping on themselves and inadvertently making problems worse. You know, so I was just wondering, you know, I understand kind of the legal liability issues around those things, but I didn't know if you had any practical advice from your experience for how to help companies in that situation that, you know, have good intentions, want to make change, but they just don't have the experience, or they're hesitant, or they're afraid of making the situation worse just based out of inexperience.
Sure. So there's a couple of things. So you may engage an external partner to help with that. And there are a lot of consultants who can help devise a DE&I strategy from inception of, we need to, listen to our employees. How do we do that? How do we understand what's going on in our organization, to more robust services? But also, these are smaller companies. They may or may not have a council, affinity groups, or leaders who are marginalized or identifies with marginalized communities, who they can tap to understand what we should be doing. And that means what we should be doing to understand what our employees are experiencing, not what we should be doing as a company holistically. And can you create this DE&I program? Because you don't want to burden the people who you're trying to help. And that can, so we've found that, for example, with the anti-Asian attacks, partnering with our Asian American ERG to understand, what should the communication be? Should we communicate? And if we do, how? Is it external, internal, both? What should it contain? What resources can we provide? What do we do? And having that perspective from an authority within that group carries more weight, especially when the communication comes from either, the CEO that's been well informed by that affinity group or individual, that they know they're not communicating in some faux pas manner. So I would say leveraging, they're small, so they may not have an affinity group, they may have a council, and they have one person. And if you have one person, I would go with an external company to help consult on what you should be doing. And you're right, there's a lot of fear of getting it wrong, but also I would challenge, because they're probably feeling uncomfortable, and you need to sit in that space of being uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable for you, but that doesn't mean that you can't listen and be an ally. And so a lot of companies I know over the past year had these listening sessions in a variety of ways. And that's where you might be able to counsel that small company or small firm to go externally and say, can you help us devise these listening sessions? Should it be company-wide all at once? Should it be focused with groups? Should it be, small individual groups, or whatever that looks like, so that it's well informed for the type of organization that it is.
But for the listening session, the especially if it's smaller, you would say the person conducting the session, it should be like more of an outside consultant who then reports back to leadership on what they've
It
heard.
depends on the organization, but I personally think that it's important, for, yes, that because employees aren't going to be as forthcoming necessarily. If you're afraid that your CEO is going to, or, your managing partner or the head of the firm, whatever it is going to retaliate because you said, I've experienced racism here. I've experienced it on a daily basis and microaggressions and blah, 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 blah,
Right.
So, yeah.
It's interesting because on the one hand, you would think, well, that shows a lot of investment for the CEO to show up and put the time in and face-to-face listen to what people have to say. But at the same time, it's also very intimidating.
Well, that's what we did. And I know a lot of companies did. We're also quite large. And so I wouldn't say that there's no risk of retaliation because there always is. But if you have a 25-person firm, they may not feel it's an option. I'm not saying that it depends on the culture of the organization. If you have, I'm being extreme here. If you have a bully running this organization and whatever I say, you're going to hold it against me, you should probably not be in that listening session. But maybe hearing the feedback with that third party and your employees, once they've gathered it, that may be productive to have a discussion about that. Sure. And you receive the feedback and you know where you're going wrong.
Great question. Thanks.
I was going to make sure I answered your question, Sarah.
All right. So last week in particular, and really the last month, have been pretty emotional for a lot of people between the Chauvin verdict, the additional police officer involved murders, the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, a whole host of things, a lot of which is happening right here in Chicago. I read a lot about companies or even just individual managers that were canceling meetings or taking other measures to give their employees time and space to process and reflect on those events and what was going on. I'm wondering what do you think firms and companies should be doing, maybe in addition to that or going forward when events like this happen?
I think they should continue to do that. It shouldn't just be now. They should be cognizant that, we're still in a pandemic and we've had an extraordinarily challenging and stressful year or over a year now. That's really taken a toll on people's mental health and wellness, and it's showing up, right? It's showing up at work. So they should be providing a safe space, a brave space for conversation. So back to Sarah's question of, if you're going to provide a brave space, be prepared for the feedback and be prepared not to retaliate, really listen and remind your employees of what support services and what benefits you offer to provide them this psychological safety, to take care of their mental health and wellness. If, it's standard after something like this that you now going forward will have, the afternoon off or what have you, remind your employees, communicate. I would say communicating what the company is doing and what is available to the employee. Not just, hooray, look at us, we're so great, we put out a statement, but here's what we're doing for you. Here's what's available for you if you need it.
Those are all great. What do you think that, you mentioned obviously the pandemic that we're still among, but maybe where the light is at the end of the tunnel, hopefully. How do you think, either how has the pandemic and people working remotely or in a reduced capacity environment, how has that affected DE&I? Has it been good, bad, a little mixed? And what do you think we can do as we move back to more interactive lifestyle again? Are there aspects we should keep or just definitely get rid of?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't think it's any secret to anybody on this call that we've seen a lot of women drop out of the workforce and regress the progress that women have made by decades. So that whole she session, right? And I think the advantage has been of the pandemic. Working remotely has made us realize that, you know, our colleagues, our bosses, we're all real humans. We've literally had a peek into like their homes, their home office, into their lives, and that they have these full lives outside the office and they're not just one dimensional. I think with the George Floyd murder and the racial reckoning over the last year, you know, that continues. We've also seen an appetite for real, candid conversations about the true experiences that people have in this country, and in the workplace all over the world, you know, and what they've experienced their entire lives. And I do believe that these events have finally kicked the door wide open for DE&I. Usually it's DE&I people who are asking for things, and now it's people asking, what's my firm doing? What's my team doing? What's the company doing? So, you know, asking like, are we making a statement? So it's made the case for DE&I, and you can start the conversation possibly at, you know, step 2 instead of the buy-in part for the most part. I do think once we go back to the office, it's going to be an adjustment period as we return to whatever that new normal will be. I am hoping that we can retain the learnings from all of the events that have occurred from, you know, being isolated and a pandemic and you know, the racial reckoning as well, and that we can continue to work towards action and that we can have authentic interactions with our colleagues. I'm hoping that we can, coming back to the office, having experienced all of this, that it's made us more resilient, but also more understanding and open as well. But I do think we're going to have an adjustment period there.
Definitely. What do you think are some day-to-day practices that we could be implementing as we shift back, you know, and reintegrate ourselves with our diverse co-workers?
Well, that's a good question. Well, we all create or contribute to the culture at our organizations, whether you're in a firm or at a company in-house. You know, establishing this sense of belonging for everyone is something that you can do daily. You're leading something, even if you're not leading the organization. You're in charge of some work that you can possibly advocate or suggest that another person who isn't being included can be. I think another big thing is being an ally, and that's something you can do on a daily basis. You know, the biggest part of that is listening. So I talk a lot, I'm guilty of that, but we must listen to other people. And I can't stress enough that being intentional and aware of our own biases will help us to listen more. So you've likely all heard about the Harvard Implicit Association test. If you haven't taken it, there are several quizzes there, and I would encourage you to take several of them. I guarantee you're going to be surprised by your own biases, and being aware of that will help you in these conversations on a daily basis, right? And just being cognizant of how you interact, because you know you may have a propensity of bias for something. Being open to feedback, honest, critical feedback, and doing something with it. You know, not just it's very hard for people, myself included. It's very hard to receive criticism, but if somebody says to you, because you're trying to be an ally, this isn't working and here's why, and instead of taking it personally, like, how am I contributing to this culture where this environment at work where somebody doesn't feel included, where they don't feel like they belong? And I'm sure you also have heard of amplification, where you amplify other people's voices, especially women of color, and marginalized groups. You know, help build their brand by amplifying, repeating, stressing a good idea that they have and not allowing somebody else to take credit or not allowing it to just kind of fall off the conversation where it's not even acknowledged, and talking about them when they're not in the room, but where decisions are being made and helping to build that brand. You know, Nikki's really great at client relations. You know, I sat in on a call and she was phenomenal. The client was super happy. You know, that will help in addition to amplifying a person's voice. So that's just, I mean, those are things you can do on a daily basis.
Yeah, those are great and sort of like low-hanging fruit, you know. It's not
Yeah.
hard to repeat somebody else's good idea.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
You mentioned the Harvard Implicit Association test, and maybe we can do this offline, but if we could create sort of like a cheat sheet of resources that we could circulate among this group, I think that would be really great to compile some of your favorite go-to resources that
Absolutely
you would recommend for people. We only have a couple minutes left. Go ahead.
Chime in with just a comment. Lizzy, you're clearly, after this discussion, your wealth of information. You do all of this sort of completely cold. I mean, I would need, you know, reference materials, you know, boards, and so, you know, the way you've laid everything out, the case for, the how to. I mean, I'm convinced we should get a transcript of this video, put your name on it, and publish it as a book. But you know, and maybe, you know, I'll reach out to the leadership and ask them to maybe we could compile this as a Q&A for you know, again, as resources that we offer, right? If an employer who doesn't have the privilege of having you at their disposal, but want to tap into some of this, of course, you know, the question comes up constantly for me in terms of burdening the minority that are already overwhelmed and are struggling under the daily headlines, right, that we had just discussed, and are also burdened with them dragging the rest of us across the finish line. You know, it's definitely a balance, and it's worth, you know, the way I come to terms with it is that it's something to keep in mind always. And if we need to then give you extra time to self-manage and get the rest that you need to recharge and sort of jump back in there. Another resource that I, and our discussion had tracked so closely to a book I just read. It's called Authentic Diversity by Michelle Silverton.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so impressed by her writing because it is the most concise way of putting a case for diversity. She talks about minimizing the monetary value behind diversity and sort of putting your heart in it first, because that's what's going to make a difference, right? Time and again, we've seen companies step forward with all these desires, and time and again we've seen them sort of peter out, right? You know, it's almost inevitable. So I almost brace myself after every, you know, onset of rigorous energy surrounding the issue. It will eventually simply go away, right? There will be another appointed committee that is sort of, you know, goes by the wayside. So in any case, you know, I'd love to add Michelle Silverton's book to our resource list. But like I said, your comments track the book exactly. I don't know if you go.
Oh, good. I'm glad you.
Yeah, you must have.
I haven't read her book, but she's phenomenal.
Maybe it's your pseudonym. So in any case.
No, I've heard she's a phenomenal speaker. And so you may know her from the Illinois civility. Profession. So, you all probably know better. The Commission on Civility in the Legal Profession. And so she was a former big law attorney, was there for a while, and she left and she's doing her own thing, consulting. And I've heard her speak several times. She's fantastic. And I haven't read her book, but I'm glad to know that it's tracking. So I'm not contradicting her.
100%. 100%. Like it. You know, so she took the pages out of your book or vice versa.
I don't know about that, but she's really great. And so any resource that she could offer, her book, definitely support her.
I listened to an audio version of it, and it was fantastic.
Mhm.
Those are who haven't come across the title. It's available through my library, but I will purchase the copy of the book just to support Michelle.
That's great. Yeah, and so Nikki, I'm happy to put resources, more broad, resources together, because I'm sure you have a lot of like the legal profession resources, but there are even broader resources that we can compile and distribute to this group or to ChiWIP. Happy to do that.
That would be great. Do we have other questions? We're getting towards the end here of our time. I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity if they want.
I have a question regarding, I work for a large company, and there has been a lot of efforts that have been put forward to date, including expanding our affinity groups, acknowledging, because there used to be one multicultural group, and now we have multiple groups, and really empowered those groups, tied those groups to executives, so they have executive sponsors, and then so the people we can connect with directly to address some of the issues that we see that impact our the groups in which we are members, either because of our own background or because of allyship. But one of the things that I'm constantly worried about is the people who are invested, they show up, they participate, but there are a lot of people within the organization who don't show up, and in every organization. How do we connect with them? How do we communicate with them? Because I feel like they can become the silent majority, and I worry that that's why we haven't seen much change, is that they are not vocal. They may have fears and other concerns that are not being heard and addressed because they're quietly staying in the background, because thus far the system has worked for them and they've seen these before. We've seen these conversations come and go before. So what are some other ways, if you have any ideas, because I'm not also expecting you to solve the problem, but have you seen any other ways of approaching that for those to sort of get conversations, engagement with those folks, so that we can truly move things forward?
So I want to clarify, are you talking about maybe people who are resistant?
I'm
because
talking,
they're not involved?
I'm talking about people who, frankly, even if they may feel that they are not racist or they are not, but that they also benefit from the system. So maybe there is this fear of rocking the boat, because how will it impact them in the long term?
Yeah, that's very challenging. There is an organization, and I'll just give you an example. There's an organization called Catalyst. It's Canadian based, but they focus mainly on gender parity. And they have a program, for example, White Men as Allies. And the entire program is for white men in positions of power who are resistant or not involved or who benefit from this imbalance of power to be in this program. And something like that, it sounds like you're talking about that type of group that would be attending something like that. It is very difficult, but this goes back to accountability and the value proposition. What's in it for me? What's in it for them? If they are benefiting and don't want to be involved because they think it's going to create this environment where they're no longer in whatever status position or have the opportunities, that has to be made clear what's in it for them. And if you're speaking about engaging them directly, again, I would encourage direct conversation, but also opportunities to become involved that are more about a business initiative than a diversity initiative. Because people get that group, so I'm going to call them the resistance, right? The resistance are going, like, the moment you label it a DE&I thing, they're not going to want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So you have to create the value. So for example, one of the things that I'm sure we all have been voluntold, right? It would be great from a leadership opportunity if you would be the executive sponsor of this affinity group. From somebody who you know, like, great, I'm going to be the executive sponsor of this affinity group, even though I don't really want to do it. And that's happened at our organization in several different capacities. And they admitted after being in the role that they didn't want to do it. They were resistant. They thought this was not going to benefit them in any manner. Not only benefited their business because of referrals, they also learned about the community that they were supporting. They also learned like what the institutional struggles were, what the experience was for those individuals who didn't identify as that person. And they were kind of dragged to do it. But there was also a benefit to them in that this is part of your leadership track. So not only are voluntold and you kind of have to do it, but you're not obligated necessarily. You're given a choice. They could have said no. They all said that we know I could have said no and I could have done something else. But they saw that the visibility in the organization was going to be beneficial for them, the leadership capability that they wouldn't have maybe received in their current role of their career, because the position just didn't allow for whatever that extra thing they wanted skill to develop. And then the partnerships too of the, where they wanted to work. I'm at a bank. If you're in commercial banking, you likely don't have a lot of interaction with capital markets. And so the exposure, like, I want to know what's over there, and the people who were part of that. So the value proposition is going to be really something to focus on as opposed to the DE&I initiative part.
So
I know
tying
we're
it
at
to goals, tying it to leadership opportunities. Okay.
Yeah, it has to be something that's in it for them as well. And here's the thing: what's good for the organization is likely going to be good for everyone, because the way we portray DE&I is we're going to focus on this, and these people are going to benefit. But if the company becomes more profitable and your bonus is based on profitability, and there's a formula there, it's better for you too, right? If we grow our company and there are more opportunities, that's good for you too, even if you're not this targeted group. So we tend to think of it in that silo, though. I know we're over time. I could talk for another hour, but I know everybody has busy jobs and lives to get back to. I'll turn it back to you, Nikki.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me and we will pass it on to Lizzy. We'll work on that sort of cheat sheet of resources. And hopefully we will have more conversations just like this one going forward. I know I learned a lot. It has been a really great hour for me. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lizzy, for your insight and expertise and your time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thanks for everyone, their questions and being so engaged.